Kofi woke up with the first light of dawn. Life in his northern African village had begun as usual. But for Kofi, things weren't the same as before. He used to head out to his fields early in the morning, harvesting the abundant crops from the fertile soil. But for the past few years, everything had changed. The rains had become scarce, and the soil's fertility had almost vanished. No matter how hard Kofi worked or how deep he dug, the result was always the same: weak plants, thirsty crops, and soil that never seemed to be satisfied. Kofi pressed his hands into the earth. The soil was no longer soft, nor was it fertile. All the methods his father had taught him seemed to fail one by one. His father used to say, "You don't just work the land, you talk to it, you try to understand it." But now those words felt meaningless. Everyone in the village was in the same situation. Fields were drying up, and people were hopelessly waiting for rain. Kofi, struggling with his thoughts, decided to visit his grandmother Alma, one of the village elders. Alma was a respected figure in the village, known for her wisdom and deep connection to the land. When Kofi arrived at his grandmother's hut, he found the elderly woman sitting in an old wicker chair. As soon as Alma saw the worry on her grandson's face, she knew what he wanted to ask. "The lands have dried up, the crops aren't growing," Kofi said, his voice heavy with despair. "No matter what I do, nothing works. Everything my father taught me feels useless." Alma smiled softly. "Stories don't just tell us about the past, they also shed light on the future. Long ago, when the rain stopped and the land became barren, we performed a ritual. That ritual helped us make peace with the spirits of the land. When I was your age, I saw it myself. If you want the land to speak again, you must make peace with it." Kofi found it hard to believe what his grandmother was saying, but he had no other options. Desperation pushed him to try anything. He decided to perform the ancient ritual his grandmother had taught him. Before sunrise, he would go to the oldest tree in the village. That tree symbolized his ancestors' connection to the land, and everyone in the village considered it sacred. The next morning, Kofi went to the great tree. Even here, the soil was dry, and the tree had shed its leaves, standing tall like an old wise figure. Kofi sat under the tree, remembering what his grandmother had taught him, and began to dig into the earth with his hands. No matter how hard the soil had become, Kofi used his hands to try and feel it. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to listen to the land, just as his grandmother had said. He stayed there for hours, as if waiting for the earth to breathe. That night, Kofi had an old dream. In his dream, the spirits of his ancestors appeared to him. A group of elderly men and women gave him wise advice. "The land is not just the ground you walk on," they said. "It speaks to you, it lives with you. If you don't respect it, it will turn its back on you." Kofi woke up with a deep sense of unease. He realized that he had been seeing the land merely as a tool. But the land had a spirit, and he needed to understand it, to show it more respect. At dawn, Kofi returned to his fields. This time, he decided to do things differently. He started by carefully turning the soil and created a new irrigation system to avoid wasting water. He paid close attention to each plant's roots and inspected every tree one by one. He was trying to reconnect with the land. For the first few weeks, not much changed. But Kofi remained patient. Every morning, he woke up early to check on his fields. Each day, his connection with the land deepened. One day, unexpectedly, small green shoots began to appear in his field. Kofi stared at the sprouts in amazement. There had been no rain, but the land had responded to him. This small success reignited Kofi's hope. Soon, the other farmers in the village noticed his progress. Even those who had mocked him at first were now surprised by the plants growing in his field. They began to wonder about his methods and came to visit his field. Kofi shared what he had learned from his grandmother and what his ancestors had told him in the dream. "You must talk to the land," he said. "Don't just see it as a tool that gives you crops. The land has a spirit, and if you respect it, it will give back to you." At first, no one believed him. But as the drought continued and crops were in danger of disappearing, the other farmers decided to follow Kofi's example. A small change began in the village. Farmers started to see their fields with fresh eyes. They treated the soil with more care, used water more thoughtfully, and remembered the old rituals. Kofi's methods became a beacon of hope for the village. Months later, when the long-awaited rains finally came, the fields in the village began to flourish again. Kofi's field, however, was the greenest and most bountiful of all. The village held a grand celebration. The arrival of the rains and the rebirth of the crops brought great joy to everyone. At the end of the festivities, Kofi sat next to his grandmother. Alma looked at her grandson with pride. "The land has forgiven you," she said. Kofi smiled at her and replied, "No, we've learned to understand the land." Kofi was no longer just a farmer, he had become the village's leader and a guide who was in harmony with nature. His story not only changed the village's fate but also helped them rediscover the true meaning of the land.